Hello and welcome, fellow awesomeologists, to Awesomeology. I'm Sue.
And I'm Ben, and in this episode, we're welcoming Cathy Statz, Cooperative Educator, Creative Connector, and World Traveler. I want to hear more about that. Welcome to the show, Cathy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we are so excited. It sounds like you have so much experience and expertise, and we have so many questions we're going to end up asking you. But before we start learning all of that and we dive in, I think it would be really good of us to give our listeners a little bit of context and a quick introduction to what a cooperative is before we talk about your life as a cooperative educator. How does that sound?
That sounds fabulous. I would love to do that. I spend a lot of time doing just that.
Well, we thought you'd be good at it.
Well, I always preface, any conversation like this with the acknowledgement that I am a generalist. I've decided I'm specializing in generalism, actually, because I am not a co-op developer. I do not have a business background. I don't get into legal and taxation issues. I am kind of a co-op cheerleader, but I think our world needs that too. So with that in mind, when folks ask me, well, what's a co-op? I said, well, here's the basic premise, right? It is an enterprise in which the folks who need a product or service or employment or an opportunity to market products, it's a business that they own. That ownership is distributed, right, amongst everybody who needs that thing, whatever the thing is. They control it democratically, right? So it's typically one member, one vote, but they benefit from it proportional to their engagement with it, right? So it's a business. People need the thing. The people who need the thing control it. They control it democratically, and they benefit from it, but they benefit from it proportional to their use. And that's sort of the most simple definition. It's a variation of what's used by the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA. And that seems to give folks a good sense of the basic notion of what a co-op is. Now, I could go on, and I will, but
we hope you will. We've got an hour.
Well, that's the basic definition I often use.
Cool. And a nice way to simplify it, because there's some variation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But tell us, how'd you get started in cooperatives, and what was the journey to what you do now?
Well, I have learned over the years that I'm in a sort of a very privileged position of having sort of always known about co-ops. I grew up on a dairy farm just outside Madison, near Sauk City, Prairie du Sac, sort of between Madison and Baraboo. And so, as many farm families are, we're very involved in co-ops, right? So we shipped our milk to a dairy co-op. We marketed our milk through a dairy co-op. We bought a lot of our agricultural inputs through the local cooperative. My dad served on the local co-op board. So co-ops are kind of all around you when you grow up in agriculture. Not everyone, though, who grows up in agriculture sort of knows what that means. I was lucky to have actually participated in a youth and summer camp program from a quite early age that actually taught about the cooperative business model. And that was through the Farmers Union. The Farmers Union in Wisconsin has run a co-op summer camp program since the 1930s. I started attending sort of day classes and day camps and programs when I was about 6. And then when I was 9, I started going to the overnight camp. And that, I can tell you more about that, but that really introduced me to the language, the examples, the definitions, and the spirit of cooperatives, and at a really early age, from which I'm very thankful.
Yeah. So you just mentioned a whole bunch of other cooperative types. So I'm going to bounce back to your definition, and maybe you can tell us some of the nuance or some of the differences between them based on what you've seen, and maybe things you I don't know, that you like about some or don't like about others. Not that there's nothing to not like,
All
maybe.
co-ops are fabulous.
Yeah.
But it is helpful to think of them in kind of a couple of categories, particular categories. And we would do this at the summer camp, the summer camp program that I grew up in, and then also ran for 30 years. So a lot of my passion for this comes from having explained co-ops to 8-year-olds. And, really, frankly, that's probably the basic level of understanding we should always start with, just to be understood. So that those types I would usually describe, to kids in particular, but any audience really, is like, who has the power, right? So who holds the power in this particular cooperative business example? Growing up in agriculture, the folks producing a product are one very important type that you see in rural America. They're often anchor businesses in those communities, in those rural communities, right? So it's the power is being held by the producers, right? They are creating something for the market, and their aim is to basically get as much as possible from that market for it, right? So dairy farmers are pooling their milk. Cranberry growers are pooling their cranberries. We find this with rice and citrus and all kinds of different agricultural products, but particularly those that are most perishable, right? So this is why a vast majority of our country's dairy products are marketed through cooperatives, because pre-refrigeration, farmers were pretty powerless because they couldn't hold that product until the price improved. They had to sell it like right now.
Yeah.
Making it into cheese helped a little bit, but even that, was you only have such a shelf life when you have no refrigeration. So the idea of folks coming together who are going to try to get more power in the marketplace by banding together to sell that thing or to market that thing that they make, right? That's the producer model. And we have lots of different examples in that space that are pretty familiar to folks who shop in grocery stores, which is just about everyone, right? So Welch's, Sunkissed, Sunmade, Florida's Natural, Blue Diamond, Tillamook, Land O'Lakes, Organic Valley, Cabot Creamery. These are all Busselman's, Treetop. These are all food brands which are owned by farmer cooperatives, producer cooperatives. Those are some pretty big companies, right? Those are some big names, big brands, and a lot of them. Not Organic Valley's more recent, having gotten started only about in the 1980s. But a lot of the rest of them were started in either the late 1800s or the early 1900s by farmers who were kind of held hostage, by the big corporate ag and the railroads, and said, "Hey, wait a minute, we could do this differently." They'd learned about co-ops. We can talk more about that later. They'd learned about co-ops in other places and decided to apply it here in the U.S. So there's a producer power sort of structure. The one that folks in credit unions would be most familiar with is the consumer model, and that's where food co-ops fall. It's where REI co-op, right, country's largest consumer co-op, the outdoor sporting goods, camping gear, credit unions, housing co-ops, telephone co-ops, electric co-ops. These are all the power structure of folks needing something and coming together to buy it more affordably, right? Or it didn't exist at all, right? So in the case of the rural electric cooperatives, right, the investor-owned utilities just wouldn't run power to rural places because there wasn't any money in it for their shareholders. Yeah. So the same farmers who created some of those producer co-ops also realized that they could band together in a consumer power structure to buy inputs, buy feed, seed, and fertilizer, build their own electrical system, build a farm credit system. Rural and urban folks were turning to credit unions as a great way to access financial services. And that model is sometimes better known, right, in urban spaces, and certainly very, very helpful for folks of modest means who are trying to access the things that they need. That is our second kind of basic model. And then we have worker co-ops. And these are a little bit less well known. They're really starting to grow now for a variety of good reasons. But that's where the employees own the company, right? And so not an ESOP. Now, sometimes folks go, oh yeah, like Woodman's, they say they're employee owned. They must be a co-op. Not so. They fall under this other category in which employees can have ownership, but somebody else, some other group is probably still the majority owner and has majority control. So things like ESOPs, which stands for Employee Stock Ownership Plan or Program, do give employees a certain amount of ownership, probably, a kind of a retirement plan, if you will.
Sure.
But there's not really that sort of democratic control piece that you find in a true worker co-op. So a good example for folks around the Madison area would be Union Cab, like the taxi cab company that is owned by the drivers. Isthmus Engineering and Manufacturing, also owned by all of the employees there. And there are some more contemporary examples, which are pretty cool. So any small business that isn't sure, what the future might look like after the current owner or owners retire, they might not want to sell it to a corporate entity. They maybe don't have a single individual with the capacity to buy it outright. They don't want to just shut it down. They've got employees that have been there a long time who are loyal and who, love the work and love the communities they live in. Well, why don't you sell it to all those employees? And there's a really cool example of that has been developed just in the last couple of years in Spring Green, Mays Maney area with a vet clinic. Vet clinics often are owned by the vets. Mm-hmm. The vet, the practice is owned by the vet. And in this case, the vets were getting ready to retire. They didn't have any single young vet with the capacity to buy the practice, but they had a really great group of staff who loved the work, and they didn't want to sell out to a corporate. So they said, well, what if we sell it to all these great employees? And they have, and it's been really transformational. It's kept those jobs in the local community. It's kept that clinic locally owned. And those employees now have this additional layer of empowerment around knowing they own the place, which is pretty cool. So workers, kind of the third big type. Then there's another purchasing, which folks might recognize. Ace Hardware as an example. Right? Small businesses that band together to be able to buy sometimes bulk purchasing, but also things like national branding, insurance services, back office support, employee benefits. So the purchasing co-op space is a little bit less visible, to the average person on the street, but those are really important for small businesses and allow folks to come together to get kind of the goods and services and training and insurance and all kinds of things to let them retain their, local independent ownership.
Yeah.
Those are the biggies.
Yeah. Awesome. And like you were saying, when you were kind of, naming some of them, when you were leading with ag co-ops, like even outside of that category, you just gave excellent proof that they are all around us, all kinds, serving all sorts of needs. So thank you. And a really nice way to categorize them in a clean way too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when we talk about them at camp, I would have sort of a grid, right, with the power dynamic on one axis, if you will, and then the purpose on the other axis, right? Like it's also a way of teaching kids, in my case, in the summer camp environment, what are the things we need in communities, right? We need electricity, we need healthcare, we need transportation, we need food, we need financial services. And then you could just, connect the two lines where those intersect. Okay, we have a consumer-owned financial institution. That's where credit unions live, right? We have a producer-owned agricultural company. That's where, Sunmade or Ocean Spray lives. Yeah. And it gave kids a sense of, both who holds the power and then for what purpose does it exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That it's such an excellent way to look at it. I think I've been working in credit unions. This is my 26th year that I've been working in the credit union. And so really, I fundamentally felt I understood cooperatives pretty well, Cathy. And I never really thought about it from the lens of who holds the power.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, you have already said something transformational to my brain today. So
fantastic. It warms my educator's heart to hear that. Thank you, Sue.
Good. Well, speaking of educator, what then does a cooperative educator do? What do you do other than exactly what you just did for us?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, that's a lot of it is, these sort of outreach opportunities. But, the educator hat can be worn in a lot of different ways. And for many years, in fact, ever since I started working for Wisconsin Farmers Union back in the late 1990s, I've been a member of the Association of Cooperative Educators, or ACE. That's a cross-border, cross-sectoral, cross-language professional development association. And we had a campaign a few years ago, that was like, I am a cooperative educator. And it was all kinds of different folks in the cooperative space. And when I say cooperative, I always include credit unions in that, of course, and that whether you're sort of intentionally teaching people about the model, or whether you're an academic who's maybe, doing research around cooperatives and then figuring out how to translate that research into practical strategies for folks who are working in practice in cooperatives, whether you're an industry person who's got a member services job, or you work in communications. Lots of education happens in all kinds of ways. And one of the things that I really encourage folks in the cooperative space to think about is, yes, educate on your purpose area, right? Going back to that notion of the grid, educate about your purpose, right? So in credit unions, financial literacy, in food co-ops, right? Healthy eating, in agricultural co-ops, how to, manage the market, in REI, how to enjoy and protect the outdoors, right? All of those different types of co-ops, those sectors, those industry spaces have particular educational goals around the industry that they live in, right? But I also want to remind folks that principle we have in cooperatives of education, training, and information is also literally about co-ops themselves, about what it means to be a member-owned business, and how you really need to, number one, protect the model. We can talk more about that, but as folks in credit unions know, right, it's not a foregone conclusion that we just always will have this model available to us. The other sectors have similar challenges that are raised when folks don't like the way they're taxed or not taxed, or the other benefits that they are given because they're member owned, because they operate on a different mindset than the sort of extractive shareholder value one. So getting folks to think about the value of also teaching about what it means to be a co-op, literally. What does that look like for you as a member, as a staff person, as a leader, as a board member, in management? I think it's really important, and there's lots of ways to do it. There's kind of formal ways through programs and professional development. There are casual ways, which are sort of my favorite, right? The sort of guerrilla education, if you will. Like, trust me, I don't take Uber or Lyft very often. I take public transit and Amtrak and stuff all the time, and walk and whatever. But, those rare times when I have to, get in an Uber or Lyft, you better believe that somehow I'm finding a way to bring the conversation around to the drivers cooperative in New York and Denver, where an identical platform in the sense of a shared ride access has emerged, except it's owned by the drivers.
Right.
Right? So I will find a little way to say, hey, how's Uber treating you lately? The answer is usually not good. And I say, well, this might come to your city at some point, so maybe keep your eye out for it. But there is a new platform, that's being used in New York and Denver called the Drivers Cooperative, where the drivers own the platform, and the profits therefore are really redistributed back to the drivers, right? Because they're the owners, and they're like, whoa, what? So those are all little opportunities to communicate the cooperative difference, just in your everyday life. Yeah. And I love those too. Sometimes I think those might be even more powerful, right?
Yeah.
You're planting a seed, which might take years to come to, to fruit.
I feel like when you dive into, you look under the hood of what a cooperative is, and you start to talk about things like cooperative principles and, this shared ownership and redistribution of wealth and profit. The place most people wind up is like, well, why wouldn't I be a member of a credit union? Why wouldn't I do as much business as I can with cooperatives over other kinds of businesses? And I'm saying all this because I'm absolutely teeing up the next question, which is, knowing all of that, that's a big challenge that cooperatives face right now, is just sharing an understanding of the model and the spirit and the benefits to people to buy from them, interact with them, be members of them, et cetera. What are some other cooperative business challenges that people are facing right now?
Well, just in general, I know you've already sort of referred to it, but I often say, what other business model has to explain the business model as well as try to, market a product or service, right? Nobody else has to do that.
Yeah.
Like, what? So it's why I'm a big advocate for broad cooperative awareness and education for the general public, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise we've got to spend a lot of time telling them what we, are, as well as what we do. So I mean, I already mentioned sort of the advocacy space and the real, very real concerns about the structures that allow us to do this kind of business, and that they are frequently under attack, and that or simply a victim of ignorance, right? So I think that folks who are in, our civil society need to know what have just enough knowledge about the co-op model to know that it's different, and to be able to ask a few more questions. I mentioned REI earlier. There was, past tense, a similar co-op in Canada up until just a few years ago called Mountain Equipment Co-op. And I won't go into the long story of it, but the gist is they ran into some financial problems, and they did not have expert advice that understood what a co-op was. And those attorneys said, oh, well, I understand that you've got this, that there are all these people that apparently have some stake, but each of those stakes is so minuscule that you actually don't need to tell them you're thinking about selling this business to a private investor.
Mm.
And they did. They sold the co-op without the membership knowing, and the membership was outraged.
I'm sure.
It was too little, too late. So they lost their co-op. I mean, it was a huge, national, millions of members, all across Canada.
Wow.
And trust me, a lot of people in Canada like the outdoors, and a lot of people in Canada like co-ops. But for whatever reason, the board itself had was maybe not really fully understanding the model, and the outside expertise was not well enough informed to say, wait a minute, though. You guys are a co-op, right? That means you have a lot of owners who probably want to be a part of this decision. Even if it ends up still needing to happen, they should at least have a chance to weigh in and be informed. And that didn't happen, right? And so I think that's a real problem, is not just the sort of board and leadership, maybe management in some cases, understanding the model, but literally the folks on the outside, attorneys, the folks that are doing the money part, all of those folks, they need to have just enough knowledge of what a co-op is to appreciate that the path forward might be different because of the ownership structure. And so that's a real danger. I think too, just, people are busy, and co-ops are slow, right? They're democratic. Democracy can be agonizingly slow sometimes. It's true, right? And in an environment, in a culture where everything is just for me right now, that idea of wait, a bunch of other people and months,
right.
Who wants to do that? But at the same time, I do think that with the younger generation, we've got a real opportunity here. There was at a National Cooperative Business Association. So the NCBA, the National Cooperative Business Association, is the country's cross-sectoral apex organization for co-ops and credit unions and mutuals. I was at their meeting a few years ago, and a speaker was talking about generational differences and said, the next generation loves co-ops. They just don't know it yet. And it was this idea that, frequently the younger generations, and this happens in many generations, right? They're more idealistic. They really want to find something that fits their, values. They want to feel like they're a part of something that has meaning. And I think even more so maybe now than some previous generations, because there've been so many abuses, right? So much concentration of wealth and power, and it's so visible to young people. They feel pretty strongly about it. And boy, if they knew, right, that co-ops, including credit unions, were, either a workplace or a way to access things that they needed, that turned that, sort of profit prioritization on its head a little bit, boy, I think it would make a real difference. So I think just lack of awareness amongst, sort of young people. And I think you got to get them young enough before their lives are busy with young families and, trying to, I think we got to start younger, because I'm a product of that. And it made a difference to me. It was like the lens through which I viewed everything. I didn't have to relearn right? This alternate business model. It just was always there. It was always there. And for me, that made, I think, a difference. And I bet it would for a lot of others too. So there's a couple. So there's, there's the awareness and education. It's whether it's from at the very top of like, public opinion leaders and legislators all the way to young people. And then, I don't know. And I think just there's the fact that folks, don't always have the patience we need to engage in cooperativism because it is slow. It's true.
And do you think too, Cathy, that one of the blessings and challenges, and you talked about, you mentioned those structures that create cooperative businesses and the sort of the constant vigilance that cooperative businesses have to maintain those structures, and the most recent example being the don't tax my credit union effort that has been going on. That part of the blessing and the challenge is that the conditions that created cooperatives have not changed. So those same forces, when we look back to the Industrial Revolution, where these things were coming up and we started seeing workers' co-ops and we started seeing credit unions, at that time we had that robber baron class, which was the thing that some incredibly impoverished people thought that they were aspiring to and could get to, to be a Rockefeller. And those were the forces that wanted to prevent that organizing. And so we sort of, they didn't go away. They maybe sort of rebranded, and and being in marketing, we know a lot about applying a brand and glossing over, some of the real intention behind what those, the big multinational companies have. But as long as they exist in the market and as long as they are fundamentally opposed, the things that cooperatives are doing, still as small as, when I think about credit unions, any of these cooperatives really, is they're just a bit player in the global economy, but the fundamental belief of them and the possibility of them still threatens these big players. And so they will probably constantly fight against it.
Sure.
Because and the blessing of that is it's because they see the potential. And that if we could educate everyone and get everyone seeing what these models can do for them and how they can be a societal benefit, then they would look at your Rockefellers, your Hearsts, whoever, and say, oh, maybe that's not how we want wealth distribution to work here. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. There were two kind of thinkers around cooperatives, 100 years ago, probably by now. And one gentleman, so it was Norris and Sapiro, and I should have written it down in anticipation of this interview because I always forget which is which, but one really maintained that co-ops were there to meet a need in the market, a gap, a void, whatever, and that when the market caught up, the co-op didn't need to exist anymore. It was just very pragmatic. Like the co-op's just there as an intermediary, as a sort of an interim solution until the market catches up, right? And the other said, no. Co-ops are there to help keep the market honest, basically, right? Like we need them because just as you said, so like these other forces will always be seeking, to take advantage, to have a greed motivation. Like we've got to have in there. But that's really the big challenge, I think, is we were just talking about this actually at the Graduate Institute for Cooperative Leadership at the University of Missouri. Carrie Jacobs does a really great program there for aspiring leaders in agricultural cooperatives. And, they were talking about the fact that it's really hard to explain the value of the co-op when the only way to like demonstrate what it would be without it is if it went away, and you don't want that, right? You don't want a massive failure to be the wake-up call, but that it's really hard for people to appreciate and understand what the co-op is and has been doing for them all these years, because there's just like there's nothing to compare it to. I mean, for example, you could look in agriculture, I suppose, and see like poultry and pork, where cooperative marketing was not as prevalent. And both of those industries are largely, right, like they're, it's all contract farming now, right? There are very few folks that own small scale. I mean, unless they're doing really direct market, sort of small scale production, they're almost all in these very, corporate controlled kind of environments. So that might be, I suppose, one example you could look to in agriculture. Whereas in dairy, for example, even though many dairy farms have gotten quite large, that the production, the marketing rather, is still cooperatively managed, and that has helped somewhat with price, although it can still be really volatile. But it's challenging, because also I think people just kind of, they get, it just overwhelms them, and we have, so different from that time, 100 plus years ago, we have a lot of cheap consumer goods and services that I think probably mask, at least temporarily, the discomfort. Think about, access to food back in the days of, the Rochdale Equitable Pioneer Society in England, the folks that kind of founded the principles. There wasn't a lot of ready-made convenience food, right? Yeah, there might be some, market sellers that would, have something hot to eat when you were out doing your trading on your trading Saturday or whatever. But that sort, it just, like that notion of sort of like that fast fashion and fast food and all of that, all of that cost is externalized, right? We're not really aware, and so it sort of seems like, well, there's plenty of food. Look, people are obese. There's so much food. There's so many calories, right? That masks the real problem. That it's not necessarily good food. It's not necessarily healthy food. Are we addicted to our phones and our entertainment? It's the old bread and circuses idea, right? Like if you give the people enough free bread and you host enough free circuses, they'll be happy enough that they won't bolt. Right? And that's, I think, what we see.
I've never heard that concept before, but yeah.
The Romans, bread and circuses. Good.
Yeah. I follow. I definitely follow.
We see it today.
So let's talk opportunities. We can see what the challenges are. What are the opportunities right now for cooperative businesses?
Yeah, I think there's a variety. I mean, the worker co-op space, for example, is, I think, tremendously powerful, both for sort of startup worker co-ops, right? So spaces where folks are looking for meaningful employment and not finding it, or for existing businesses that want to have a different way of a succession plan. So I mentioned, the succession plan already with the veterinarian co-op, right? The idea of selling an existing business to your employees. And that has a lot of potential for, right, this whole group that's already starting to retire, right? And all of that wealth transfer that's going to have, all that business transfer that needs to happen, right? But we'll just have more and more either corporatization or small communities not having those businesses that they want and need if a model like worker co-ops isn't made more available to folks as an option, right? So that means making sure that economic development organizations in rural communities are familiar with it, right? That the folks who do business loans, that understand it, like a whole series of things will help make that a little bit easier. But also just to know that they could be created from scratch, essentially. So like home care, for example, lots and lots of folks would like to age in place. It's much more affordable. It's often more comfortable, but they need a little support, right? They need somebody to come in and do some housekeeping, maybe some hygiene care, maybe do a little shopping, maybe some food prep. And the folks who do that work are often independent contractors with no benefits, no vacation time, and no workers' comp, right? So think of that as an independent contractor. If you're in home care and you hurt your back lifting someone out of a bathtub, you're just out of work.
Mm-hmm.
It's very precarious. And a lot of the folks who do that work are, new Americans, they're recent immigrants, they're people of color, they're often women with modest educations and modest incomes to begin with. And so it's very precarious. But that group of workers could be organized and has been organized all across the country into worker co-ops, home care co-ops, so that they can be now still providing great care, but do it in a company they own, right? And so think about for agencies that might need a contract for care, they now have one entity instead of like 16 people, right? That they're sort of negotiating or contracting with. The people themselves, and again, it's primarily women, have better wages, time off, workers' comp, insurance, and just a tremendous sense of empowerment, right? But then also think about those clients to whom they're providing care. When home care workers are, coming in and out of the work frequently, they do it for a while and they get hurt, or they do it for a while and they decide it's just not paying good enough and they leave, right? Then some of those very vulnerable members of our communities, elderly folks, differently abled folks, have to sort of, get used to a whole new person providing, how do they like their eggs cooked? Intimate care, like bathing. And, right? It was Ben for like 6 weeks, but now it's this Sue person. I don't, and they get, especially if they have memory care issues or other factors where routine is really important, right? So it can be very disruptive for the individuals who need that care too. So the home care worker co-op example is such a powerful one because it benefits everyone, right? Not just the workers. And so I think that's really a great opportunity space. Affordable housing, right? So folks that are looking at what are called limited equity housing co-ops, and those sometimes are in urban spaces, but they could be rural too. And those I think are intriguing because they can take a lot of different forms. It could be an apartment building, but that's what the limited equity housing co-ops usually are like. They're modest apartments where folks don't own their unit like they would in a condo, right? But you own a share in the co-op that entitles you to live in a particular unit. And the limited equity model means that you earn some equity on that share you have in the cooperative over time, but it's sort of a steady, modest amount. So if you move out, you get that equity, but the access to the housing remains affordable for that next person who wants to move in. In other words, your share is not being sold at market rate. Yeah. So it protects you if the market has dipped significantly, that you still will get that agreed upon amount. If the market's great, you might not get as much out, but it retains the affordability for the next member who wants to move in. So those are really interesting. And then resident-owned communities, or ROCs, is a really cool space for transitioning manufactured housing, what we might call mobile home parks or trailer parks, sort of casually, considering that if the owner of a park wants to sell that property, it's often being sold for development. Those individuals who live there, probably many of them own their units, right? They own their trailers. They own an asset, which, if that property is going to be sold and developed, is now essentially worthless, right? We all know that mobile home is a misnomer. A manufactured home, once it's set down there for 10, 15 years, you're not going to move that anywhere without having some major structural issues, right? So that asset that these folks have, saved for and maybe even paid off is now essentially worth nothing if a park is sold for development. So there have been some really interesting examples of folks assisting the residents of manufactured housing parks to buy the property as a cooperative, right? They continue to own their unit, but they own the land in common underneath. And, when you think about workforce housing, rather, just affordable housing in general, I mean, those are significant opportunities for affordable housing that we sometimes forget, and they don't have to be, they can be cared for. And how better would they be cared for, right? If the people who live there actually own it,
yeah,
right? Have some say, and and that the whatever they still usually pay like rents, if you will, or like a monthly fee, even if they own the park together, because that they still need to provide upkeep for the property, lights and sewer stuff if necessary, or drainage or whatever. But it's not being extracted out of the park. It's being used to benefit the park itself and its residents, its owners. So that's a really cool opportunity space, I think, as well. And these are both examples that are for really modest income people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And just in general, I think for people to understand better the different types and sectors. I think even folks within co-ops, deeply committed to their co-ops, whether it's credit unions or ag co-ops or food co-ops, they, and I get it, particularly if you're working in a space like rural electrics or credit unions, where there's an incredible amount of regulation and you're always facing, these challenges from the investor-owned, versions of yourself that, to have the luxury to sort of lift your eyes for a moment, take a breath and go, oh, we're just like this other business or businesses in our community. And we don't really do anything with that. We don't reach out to them. We don't celebrate our co-opness
Right.
Often enough. And to use it also as a way to raise the visibility of the model for those opinion leaders and those those folks that are looking at the economic situation of that community, to be able to be seen as, one way of doing things that's different and that's community focused. And I think that that's a real opportunity space, is just for us to think more cross-sectorally more often, because it benefits us and it benefits everybody.
Right. Which is the entire cooperative model.
Mm-hmm.
To benefit everyone that participates.
Right. And the communities they live in, right? Like not
Right.
just the members. Like obviously you have to benefit the members. There has to be, right, intrinsically sort of an individual benefit accrued, really. Like, let's be honest, right? You want a low interest rate on your loan, or you want, a better price for your milk, or you want, cheaper ice axe, or whatever, wherever you want great, affordable, organic beef, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There is an individual benefit accrued, and there is a community benefit accrued, and that benefit is not just the members of the co-op and the co-op business itself, but the whole community.
Right. Absolutely fascinating. We could go on for hours.
Yeah.
Hours.
I have notes. I have so many notes about even just opportunities for our business to just like, if we're on a scale from 1 to 99 and how much we're interacting with cooperatives, not just credit unions, but cooperatives. I mean, we're in the single digits, right? And I think if we crank that up by 5, like huge business opportunity just for us, and I think that that's probably the same for every other cooperative, every other business that's kind of, I don't know, like to say it as harshly as I probably can, like kind of living under a rock a little bit about this opportunity that exists within cooperatives,
Yeah.
And you've mentioned it, like we're busy. We're all busy.
Absolutely.
So we get it, but also like we got to stop and see what's around us too and take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, people are always sort of, people in co-ops are like wringing their hands. People don't understand co-ops. They don't know who we are. Well, how are we actually strategically doing anything about that? Right.
Yeah.
And when it starts at home, it starts with, the teller at the credit union recognizing the REI logo on somebody's, polar fleece vest and going, hey, are you a member of that co-op too? That's cool. Well, what do you mean? You don't know what that means? Oh, well, we're a co-op. We're like them.
Right.
We banded together to provide financial services for folks. They banded together so people could buy climbing equipment. Boom, done. Like you've just had a mini education moment and you've had a connection moment. But how many, and I'm not just saying like credit union tellers, but like how many of that sort of frontline employee knows enough to make that connection, or they're wearing the, the cap from the local ag co-op, right?
Right.
Who are you plugged into that stuff enough to help kind of casually raise, draw attention to it, raise awareness of it. Feel like, I mean, I think folks in credit unions feel so good about being part of something that's, done so well, so for so many, for so long, like, and right. It's just one part of an even larger whole of cooperatives, and not just in this country, but globally. Right. I mean, that's something people could feel really good about. Especially at a time when things are really divided. And that's where, too, recognizing that co-ops fit all kinds of ideologies, right? Get used by politically conservative folks. They get used by very politically liberal folks,
Yeah.
across the spectrum. People find something really compelling about this model. And that's something we can really celebrate during these times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
well,
unprecedented times.
Yeah.
Ding, ding.
As Sue said, we could probably go on for hours. We can't do that though. So before we transition to closing, Cathy, how can people connect with you? Is there anything else you want folks to know? One big takeaway, anything like that?
Well, I haven't mentioned it so far. I'm kind of astonished I haven't, but 2025 is the International Year of Cooperatives, designated by the United Nations. I mean, it's been such a banner under which I've been, cheering all these months now. But it's something that I realize a lot of folks in co-ops don't realize yet. So the United Nations did declare 2025 the International Year of Cooperatives. That is just a really great opportunity to raise awareness of the co-op model and to share examples of its impact, whether it's in your local community or cross-sectorally or across the globe. So that is something that I want to make sure folks are aware of, and to bear in mind that you've got a few months before October, which is co-op month, and which of course is also when, credit day happens. And so credit union day happens. And so if you, are a member of the Chamber of Commerce, find out if any other co-ops or credit unions are members of the chamber and host an event in October that doesn't just highlight your business, but highlights all the cooperative businesses in that chamber, right? Or if you, have a Rotary Club in your community, ask if you can come and do a presentation during October and lift up, again, not just the impact of your cooperative business, but of all of the cooperative businesses in that community or that region. And Rotary International, for example, is an international organization. So they would also be interested to know about the international work of cooperatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And nice plug for Rotary. That is how I first met you, Cathy.
That's right. I didn't even do that on purpose.
All those years
just
ago.
Emerged naturally.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, let us transition into our Something Awesome segment where we share cool experiences, cool recommendations, anything that we have experienced lately that we just want the world to know about. And I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to share a link to a YouTube video that's a really cool story from CBS News about this organization called Speaker Impact. I am one that I'm pretty darn disciplined about recycling. I try to get as much life out of my clothes. I've got patches on stuff, and it pains me to know that something that could be used or reused winds up in a landfill. And that's what Sneaker Impact is really just trying to prevent. And they shared some cool stuff in the video. Fun fact, and I don't know, I haven't vetted this number, but the average person will own 256 pairs of shoes in their lifetime. They must be counting all the little ones as a baby, that as your foot grows by a quarter inch, you got to get new shoes every 2 weeks. But still, if you live to be 80, I did the math, that's 3 pairs of shoes a year. So I am underbuying shoes based on that number, but that's okay. But they take new or lightly used shoes and redistribute them all over the globe. They shred them and turn them into other products, including sandals and shoes that are made of the shreds. And then those shreds are also put into other products, flooring and all that kind of stuff. So just a really, really cool story, a really cool example of how, there's not too much in our world, physical stuff that truly is straight up garbage and can never be used again. And shoes just being, one of those daily things in our lives that we don't even think about twice. We just put them on, throw them away when they're too bad, and they probably could get a second life somewhere, some way, so.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think that I am making up for you underbuying shoes.
Okay, sweet. Well, that's cool. As long as we're hitting the quota between the two of us.
We are for sure.
Yeah,
we're hitting it. Yeah.
Sweet. All right, Cathy, you're up. What you got for us?
Well, it kind of goes back a little bit to the co-op thing, but I was really thrilled to see at this recent meeting in Missouri that all the snacks being provided for this cooperative meeting were co-op branded snacks. Mm. Right. And I think that was just, I am an advocate for that, but I don't always see that in cooperative meeting spaces, right? To say, if we're putting out some snack foods, how about Welch's fruit snacks? How about Ocean Spray craisins? How about, Organic Valley Stringles? How about, that there are all of these great food products that can be part of telling the cooperative story. So that's just an idea to plant. If you're doing, snacks for a program for kids or meeting snacks or whatever, use that opportunity to promote cooperatives by featuring some cooperative brands. It's really eye-opening to a lot of people. A lot of people have no idea, so that's something I think that's I was so glad to see it in action at the meeting in Missouri.
Yeah, great example and an easy win. I mean,
Right.
I'm just envisioning a credit union's annual meeting with those snacks out, like
Yeah.
easy opportunity.
Co-op coffee, Equal Exchange, for example, is a worker co-op that buys its coffee primarily from farmers in the global south, farmer cooperatives in the global south, and sells their finished product of coffee and chocolate and tea and dried fruits and nuts primarily to the consumer food co-ops in North America. And you can get their coffee at a lot of local food co-ops and serve that, and then have some organic Valley or Land O'Lakes creamer with it, or both. Right? What a great way to celebrate co-ops.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I'm gonna give us a hard left turn, because that is what I always do. Every time I do one of these, it is whatever. It is filled with recency bias. It is whatever I most recently did, because my attention span does not bear out anything less than whatever I just knew yesterday. But I do want to share this. I want to share a book that I just finished listening to, which I absolutely loved, and it is such a strange title. So I'm excited to say it out loud and then see both of your faces to see how you react to the name of this book. So one of the books I just finished reading, or listening to, I should say, is called Harriet Tubman Live in Concert. And it was written by Bob the Drag Queen. And it was delightful. So you have to start with an incredible amount of that willing suspension of disbelief. But the concept behind it, I'll spoil the purpose behind it, is that the concept is that we have to imagine a world where some of these famous people have just come back from the dead. They are just here now. And we are just living in a world where they are here again. So modern day Harriet Tubman and some other people that were really a part of the abolitionist movement are now alive. And Harriet Tubman wants to make a rap album. And it sounds so silly, but the main character in this book is a music producer who is really going through this journey of understanding who he is, understanding his life, and the central concept here is that everyone is held captive by something, and so freedom looks different for everyone. And it just was, when you realize that is what it is all moving up to, and that's the purpose behind why these two characters intersect, it just blows my mind. So nice. Really, really excellent book. I enjoyed it a lot. And also, bonus, Bob the Drag Queen, one of my favorites. So that also was fun because it was read by them. So yeah. That was good. So great read. Highly suggest Harriet Tubman Live in Concert.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. I will look for it.
Sounds like a book that listening to would provide quite a different experience as opposed to reading, just being able to follow the intricacy of it. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And I believe probably their first book they ever wrote. And really, this is a person who's a real performer. So really excellently read. So highly recommend. And I found out that I could get it in Spotify Premium. This is not a commercial for Spotify Premium. But when I realized I could do it was a real bonus because it's pretty new. So
Oh, nice. Nice. That's awesome.
Well, Cathy, thank you so much. This hour went by so super quickly. Fast. It was so much fun listening to you and learning. And hopefully we will get to do this again sometime.
I would love that. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, listeners. Thank you for being with us. And we hope that you go out in the world and proclaim all of the gospel of cooperatives now. And we also hope that you catch up on some of our podcasts. If this is your first time being here, you can always catch up on your favorite podcast app like Spotify, which again, this is not a commercial for, but it's there, or your Apple Podcasts or all of your favorite podcast apps. Or you can find them on our blog at exclamationqso.com/blog.
Thanks again, Cathy, for being here. Thanks, friends, for tuning in. Be awesome, and see you next time. The Awesomeology podcast is a production of Exclamation Services. Executive producers are myself, Ben Bauer, and my friend, Suzanne Campbell.
Thanks to Kyla Ganther for our show artwork, Scott Sager for booking our guests, and Alex Westerhausen for social media support.